USB-NES hardware upgrade guide and 72-pin connector replacement repair. The hardware upgrade is applicable to all USB-NES units sold before May 1st, 2022. It fixes a design flaw in the unit when trying to play certain types of NES games. The hardware bug is a known issue that's been documented on the USB-NES website. This video is basically a visual companion to that documentation. Later in the video, we'll cover how to replace the 72-pin connector inside the USB-NES unit in the event that it gets damaged from normal wear and tear. The tools you'll need to do the hardware upgrade are a 35-watt soldering iron, a roll of solder, preferably 6337, but 6040 is okay, a sponge that you can wet and clean the tip of your iron with, and a soldering iron holder. We're going to need a Phillips #1 star screwdriver. We need some cutters. We need a measuring tape or tool, and we need a 560 microfarad capacitor. This capacitor is widely available and can be purchased for less than $1 at DigiKey. So the first thing we're going to do is flip over the USB-NES unit and use our Phillips #1 screwdriver to undo all of the 6 screws on the USB-NES. Once the screws are removed, we can flip the unit over and open the dust-covered door so we can remove the top piece of the USB-NES unit. We want to use some kind of a flat prying tool to separate the bottom of the USB-NES unit from the middle section, because the plastic part around the USB header is fragile. Once we've separated the bottom section of the USB-NES unit from the middle, we're going to place our thumbs on the 72-pin connector while pulling against the sides of the USB-NES case to separate the circuit board from the middle section. We're going to cut the positive lead of the 560 microfarad electrolytic capacitor to 1/2 inch using our cutters and measurement tape. We're going to tin the leads of the electrolytic capacitor with solder to make it easier for us to attach the capacitor to the USB-NES hardware. We're going to add an excess amount of solder on the source input of the power MOSFET Q1, as well as on the ground pin on the blue pill STM32 system board. Next, we're going to solder the negative lead of the electrolytic capacitor to the ground pin on the blue pill, and the positive lead of the capacitor to the source input on the power transistor Q1. Be sure to space out the leads on the capacitor to make it easier to solder it to the USB-NES, and be sure to leave 1 millimeter of spacing between the negative lead of the capacitor and the STM32 blue pill circuit board. Once we're done with that soldering, we're just going to pop the USB-NES circuit board back into the middle frame of the case. Next, we're going to place the middle section of the USB-NES assembly back on the bottom part, being sure to align the USB plastic header piece and the posts on the back of the unit. We're going to add the top section to the USB-NES assembly we've got and close the door latch, making sure the entire unit is well aligned, and start threading in the screws to put it back together. Be sure not to over torque the screws, and be extra careful to not over tighten the front screws that are shorter than the other 4 screws, because you may end up having the screw pop up on the top of the USB-NES unit. So you only have to tighten that till it's slightly snug. And there you go. You've successfully installed the USB-NES hardware upgrade, and you're good to go to play new NES games as well as all the classics. The second half of this video shows how you can replace the 72-pin connector inside USB-NES. The replacement part is easily available on AliExpress, but the part itself isn't that great because it seems the connector pins inside it are a little shallow, which means that they're really only connecting with the very bottom of the pins on NES carts rather than, say, the middle section of the pads. And so I haven't actually been able to locate those better 72-pin connectors on AliExpress. So if someone knows a source where these better 72-pin connectors could be purchased, hit me up in the comments section, please. I just want to show you guys some options for affordable desoldering tools. So we have a tool that you can buy at Radio Shack, although I guess they're the source now, but this was basically, you know, one of the most affordable desoldering tools, although nowadays the tips are quite expensive, but you can still buy them. Then there's this Velman desoldering tool, which I bought off of Amazon, and it didn't really do the job for this project. I also bought some desoldering tips off of AliExpress, so 10 of them for $5, including the shipping, equals pretty affordable. And I also got this OK desoldering tool, very similar to the Velman, but actually internally they're a little different. Additionally, there is also the manual solder pults and other solder suckers that don't have a heated tip. Instead, you have to use a regular soldering iron. And so you would basically heat your joint and shove the tip of the desoldering, or the solder pult here, right against it. And so the idea is to try and get it as, well, you have to try and form a vacuum there so you can suck as much solder. Now, obviously, having the tip of the soldering iron there is going to obstruct that effort. So, you know, I mean, basically, you might get good desoldering on one side of the pin that you're doing, but not on the other side of the, you know, where your soldering iron was. So, I mean, you know, you can maybe use like a fine tip soldering iron or something. You can basically figure it out. But if you have a really big tool like this, well, you can see how much bigger it is than the tool with the heated tip. So basically, yeah, you're gonna get a lot of suction, which is going to improve your ability to get the solder clear out of the hole. So another important tool in our desoldering project is desoldering braid or solder wick, because this stuff is kind of like magic in a way, but it basically just removes the solder, and sometimes it does the job that the solder suckers won't do, even the heated ones. So this last tool is a Radio Shack classic, and generally speaking, it works pretty well. It's 45 watts, so it's really hot. It's hot enough to melt just about all the joints, but I don't use this tool that often because of the fact that it's actually too hot for most boards. And so it won't take long for this thing to cook the pads off of your board. So I would use this kind of tool for really tough jobs where you've basically got a mound of solder and essentially like other metal joints soldered. So basically where you just need a ton of heat. For this desoldering project, we decided to go with the OK desoldering tool, and so what that entails is you got a little poker stick that essentially fits through the 1 millimeter hole tip, the spare tip you get with it. So, and then it also comes with a 2 millimeter tip that's attached when you get the tool, which is too big for what we're doing. So the 1 millimeter will work out okay. You can get these OK desoldering tools off of AliExpress for less than 20 bucks, which is a pretty good deal in my opinion. So here's our spread. 1 OK desoldering tool with heated nozzle, 1 poker stick, and 1 millimeter tip that we'll be changing out shortly with the existing one. We want to have some kind of a soldering tool holder and a wet sponge so we can wipe the tip, any excess solder off of it. Eutectic solder 6337, 6040 is okay though. If we could get some focus there, thank you. And we got the some kind of pliers. Doesn't have to be needle nose, but you know, it's fine. Want some kind of a flathead screwdriver. We're gonna need that. We're gonna have some solder braid handy because we also need that for a special case. We got flux here, the gooey type. We're not actually going to use it, but it's there, I guess. You can use flux, it probably helps. And we got some kind of a low static cloth there. We're also going to use some 3-in-1 oil, just, you know, briefly for the tool, and that's actually optional. We got some isopropyl alcohol here. We're going to use that to clean the flux off the board in the end. We're going to have some paper towels to help us do that too. And we got you know, some kind of a toothbrush here we're using just to scrub the board with the IPA. And now we're going to take a look at oiling up this OK desoldering tool, and it's completely optional because it does come greased when you get it, but at some point you're going to have to open this damn thing up anyway because you'll need to, you know, clean out the whatever solder is in that. But what we're gonna do is we're just gonna add some 3-in-1 oil on the rubber part of the piston, and actually the rubber band is pretty tight in there, but we're also gonna oil up the walls of the cylinder, and the best way to put the piston back in is to do it on tilt the piston on an angle. And, you know, we're going to use the paper towel there to clean up a little bit of the extra oil that's going to basically, you know, kind of go everywhere at some point. And then we're going to push down the piston until the latch is engaged, and we're just going to try and shake out the excess oil because if we leave any oil in there, it's definitely going to get baked off on, you know, when the heater, when we're using the tool. So this will minimize that, you know, any of the burning oil, but you know, that's not usually a problem. So here's this Velman desoldering tool that I bought off Amazon. Originally I thought this was gonna work, but it comes with this huge 2mm tip, which is too big to actually do the desoldering work for removing the 72-pin connector. It's just too wide. And also, the spring inside the Velman, the mechanism, it's going to destroy the tool at some point, because when it kicks back that plunger, when you press the button, it puts all that force right into the block at the top of the cylinder. So now we're gonna pop our desoldering piston and cylinder back into the holster, I guess, if that's what we call it. We're going to test it out, make sure it's working okay. And now we're actually going to change the tip. So we'll use our pliers just to undo the existing 2mm tip that comes on there as default, and we'll just hand screw that thing off, because generally speaking there's no need to use the tool to do that. Put on our weirdly shaped 1mm tip. For some reason it doesn't come flat. I don't know why they did that, other than to sell the flat ones for more money, but potentially the non-flat one has less chance to wreck the board, I guess. So we're going to take this low static towel or teeth cloth and fold it into 4, and then we're going to take one of those corners and sort of put half of it over the rest, and then we're going to put the USB-NES circuit board on top of it, and so that it's kind of holds it flat that way. To help us do the desoldering work, we're gonna actually be adding solder just a tiny bit to every joint we need to desolder. Yeah, I know, it sounds pretty insane. But the thing is that the fresh solder will actually help the desoldering tip form a good bond with the joint and ensure maximum possibility of a good removal once you press the flush button to suck the solder out. So we actually encountered a problem with the desoldering tool when it came to the corners of the 72-pin connector, because the tool apparently is not hot enough to get all of the solder melted on both the top and bottom side of the circuit board. And so what happens is we can add solder, but it will not remove it on both sides. And so we're going to have to use solder wick, and we're going to use the solder, our 35-watt soldering iron to actually finish the job, but we'll leave that for last as far as that goes. So here we're just going to continue to trench through the desoldering. Obviously that first pin didn't work out for us, so we'll just deal with that later with the soldering braid. But generally speaking, we're getting actually really good progress with this tool. Yeah, we're just going to keep using it. Here we're going to use that flathead screwdriver to gently nudge the pins on the 72-pin connector where we feel like the solder has been mostly removed. And, generally we can have that indication by the fact that we can see a tiny little black hole in the inside the hole, essentially. I guess we could hold it up to some light, but, generally speaking, we can use the screwdriver, gently nudging it, using a lot of, vibration with gentle force. And this will actually really help in speeding up the desoldering process and getting this connector out of here. We've mostly removed the solder in the holes, and now it's just a tiny little amount that that's holding the pins in there. So at this point, we've basically done about 70 of the 72 pins that we need to desolder. And unfortunately, our desoldering tool couldn't handle the last 2 pins because there's huge traces connecting to these pins. So they just, I mean, you know, you need a ridiculous amount of heat. So we had to switch back to the soldering iron, and we're gonna use some solder braid to actually clean out those holes. So we can take out the connector with, yeah, we're hoping that we're not gonna damage any traces. No trace damage, and making sure that also the through holes don't remove any of the plating when we take out those traces. I mean those the 72 pin connector. And it takes a lot of heat, and so, you know, when we're using the solder wick, one of the best things we can do is we'll probably want to leave the solder wick there for a good, you know, 15 to 20 seconds, because it won't work if we don't give it enough time. And you know, I mean, you can try to agitate the solder wick as you're doing it. That might help the flow of it, like, you know, the capillary action, if that's what you would call it. But then we're going to use a screwdriver to basically to free up the pins or wiggle them. We're going to try and wiggle the connector out of there, and so we're not going to force it, we're just going to wiggle it. And essentially we're not keeping the connector. In this case, it's basically scrap, so we're not really concerned if all the pins are removed without any damage or distortion. We just want to get the damn thing out of there. So we got 1 pin left that's kind of being a little stubborn. We're just gonna, you know, touch it with the soldering iron and get it out of there. And yeah, there it goes. So what we can see now is, if we inspect the 72 pin connector that came out, yeah, we busted a few pins, that's okay, we've got a replacement. But what we're seeing is that we haven't actually torn off any of the material from the circuit board, like the plating and holes, or any remnants of any traces. So this is good. We essentially got the connector out of there without damaging the USB-NES circuit board. So that's pretty good. At this point, I should probably mention that off camera we actually used the solder sucker to clean out those holes, to make sure there wasn't any excess solder in them. And you really want to make sure these holes are clean when you put the 72 pin connector, the new one, back in there. You don't want to have to force this guy in there at all. Just wiggle the guy in there. And I mean, it's so easy to damage these connectors by one of the pins being forced up because there's solder in the hole. So you got to make sure these holes are clean. And so we've wiggled the connector in there. We've got it flush with the board now, and all 72 pins have stuck their way through to the bottom, and nothing has obstructed that. So, well, we're probably going to want to now tack the corner pins of the 72-pin connector. We'll just tack the 2 pins on the left and the 2 pins on the right. Meanwhile, you know, pinching the connector against the USB-NES circuit board so that it's flush and now we're just going to put the USB-NES board back on that cloth and do up the rest of the 68 pins on the 72-pin connector, and yeah, just sort of take it easy time, because the hard part is done, and we're putting something new back inside the USB-NES, and yeah, so we're just gonna probably fast forward that stuff. Now for this last part, I would recommend you do this, but it's completely optional. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take a paper towel and put it underneath the circuit board, but stand the circuit board up so that it's kind of standing on top of the paper towel. And what you're going to do is you're going to use the isopropyl alcohol, and you're going to put you're going to fill the cup, the isopropyl alcohol cup, and you're going to fill it with and so you're going to put your toothbrush in there, the clean toothbrush, and you're going to clean the surface. You're going to scrub it of the area where the 72-pin connector is, and the alcohol will work down the residue on the board to the point where it's basically just kind of melts away. And so just keep dipping your toothbrush in that IPA cap and brushing away the alcohol on the board into the paper towel until you're pretty much satisfied that you've cleaned it to your content. And that's pretty much it. Shift your bits with USB-NES, folks. Have a good one.